Before my suspension, a video I was making was a response to SubMan USN's video entitled Orwell Would Be Proud. I encourage everyone to go watch that video. It's only about 4 minutes long. I would show a clip from it, but the whole damn thing is perfect, so I either use his entire video or tell you to go watch it on his channel. Link in the description. Go watch it. I'll wait. SubMan, as always, ever so observant of the behavior and pathology of the feminists, but I want to really explore and expand on all of this. Orwell wrote 1984 to express his ideas about what Stalinism and communism could do to the world. Orwell identified as a democratic socialist, but utterly despised Stalinism, and any form of totalitarianism. I don't know what his feelings on Marxism were. It would stand to reason if you hate communism and Stalinism, you'd hate the foundation in which they were based on, and that's Marxism. However, he was a socialist, and Marxism is actually a philosophy based on the implementation of socialism, and some might ask, what is the difference between a socialist and a communist? The best answer I heard is a communist is a socialist in a hurry, and that's pretty much the gist of it, but then that depends on your definition of socialism.
Ladies and gentlemen, as pointed out previously, the communists can never hope to come to power over the entire United States through a so-called war of national liberation of a minority population. They can capture a large portion of it, and they can create an awful lot of chaos and destruction everywhere else. But to take the country as a whole will require an entirely different approach. The violent revolution becomes of primary value to the communists to the extent to which it can be used to condition the masses psychologically to accept the non-violent revolution, which is offered supposedly as the only alternative. Hoping to avoid further violence and bloodshed, the public is to be pressured into accepting measures that will move the country gradually and legally toward communism, but without calling it that. The strategy of the proletarian revolution calls for the quiet conversion of our government into a communist regime, but under the banner of socialism. Well, what is socialism? All right, let's define it. According to the dictionary, socialism is a political concept based upon the principle of government ownership and control of property, the means of production, and the avenues of commerce. But the important thing, as far as this presentation is concerned, is how do the communists define it? And this is where many people are surprised to learn that the communists have an entirely different meaning for the word socialism than the average American has. Did you know that there isn't a single communist country in existence anywhere on earth? That's right, not one. Russia isn't a communist country. Red China isn't. Cuba certainly isn't. These are socialist lands. That's how communist leaders always describe them. You see, according to the teachings of Karl Marx, communism will come to this world only in some future utopian era, when men will have learned to live together in perfect harmony, when they'll no longer be greedy or competitive, when they'll want to share equally with their fellow human beings and have nothing better than anyone else. When this comes to pass, there'll no longer be any need for police or for government of any kind. And then, he said, the state will wither away. When that happens, said Marx, it will be communism. In the meantime, comrades, whenever we come to power, we shall call it socialism. So the next time you hear a communist spokesman stand before a college audience or a TV camera and say innocently that all the communists are doing here in America is working for socialism, you must understand what he means by that word. What he's really saying is all the communists are doing is trying to bring to America exactly the same thing they now have in the Soviet Union and Red China. Now, they can call that socialism if they want to, but most Americans, I think, would describe that over there as communism. The new program of the Communist Party on this subject has this to say. The term socialism describes but the first stage of a new society that in its full development is called communism. Socialism is a transitional stage. Well, the important question, though, is why do the communists promote socialism? Is it merely because they honestly believe that it's a necessary transitional stage to some higher, more perfect form of society? I don't think so. I doubt very much if the communist leaders believe their own fairy tale. And I'm sure they're not so naive as to believe that their present super state is ever really going to wither away. But they promote socialism just the same, because they know that socialism, by definition, means control over people. If the government owns and controls all property, all means of production, and all avenues of commerce, then it controls all people.
His ideas, with things like doublethink and newspeak, were just observations of what he's seen in the Communist Party. The reason I bring this up is because I have noticed, whether it is feminism, any of the social justices for that matter, all of which is based on cultural Marxism, it's all about the language. Karl Marx is considered one of the three architects of modern-day social sciences. His unique Hegelian dialectic and eristic dialectic has trickled into the minds of those who now study the social sciences. I believe the way the social sciences are now taught, it actually begins to brainwash people, and I'm not exaggerating. One of the reasons, in my opinion, that communism was so hostile to religion, is because it, being based on Marxism, was a religion, or at least it does to the mind what religion does to the mind. That whole reprogramming the mind, changing our eyes to see things differently, rather than how they are, it creates a new paradigm in which all observed events unfold. Imagine, if you will, that I am holding up 4 fingers, but you see 5, because you understand that when I say I am holding up 5 fingers, the number 4 now means 5, but only because I say so. Thus this sleight of hand in the mind is the new reality. It all makes perfect sense according to its own logic. When the mind is bent in that way, old things have new meanings. Marxist philosophy has the same effect religion has on the brain. It just bends and warps reality, and it all seems to be wrapped up in the grammar, patriarchy, rape culture, privilege, objectification, rights, equality. These aren't words to them, in the way they are to you and I. These are now religious concepts. They have double meanings, and which meaning they refer to is now dependent on whichever one supports their argument, and if they make a second argument, and then must change the definition of one of these words, and you bring up their own former definition, and point out how argument 1 and argument 2 are using a keyword that must not be able to hold the same definition, they then argue on the vagueness of their first statement. They keep doing this and dancing around what any given word means and what any given statement they made actually means. They keep dancing around this until you become discouraged and stop talking to them. In the rare occasions you make some progress with them, and get them to rationalize things, and you win a battle here and there. The next time you see them and attempt to continue your argument, they have completely forgotten their defeats, and you have to start all over again with a 5-hour conversation on what the definition of any given word is. And again, if you should win a battle, and then try to resume the war the next day, they will have forgotten the entire battle of yesterday. It is impossible to talk sense to a Marxist. I believe it was chapter 2 in Mein Kampf when Hitler was talking about the first time he'd ever heard of Marxism and spoke to a Marxist. Actually, you know what, Mein Kampf is a free public domain book. Let me look for the passage I am talking about. Okay, in chapter 2, Hitler talking about the difference between talking to a German Marxist about Marxism, he was able to win the arguments and teach them their error, but with the Jewish German Marxists he could not. We can cut out the bit about them being Jewish, because honestly, the great bulk of Marxists I have spoken to aren't Jews, and Hitler's words perfectly describe it, he said.
Gradually I became an expert in the doctrine of the Marxists and used this knowledge as an instrument to drive home my own firm convictions. I was successful in nearly every case. The great masses can be rescued, but a lot of time and a large share of human patience must be devoted to such work. But a Jew can never be rescued from his fixed notions. It was then simple enough to attempt to show them the absurdity of their teaching. Within my small circle I talked to them until my throat ached and my voice grew hoarse. I believed that I could finally convince them of the danger inherent in the Marxist follies. But I only achieved the contrary result. It seemed to me that immediately the disastrous effects of the Marxist theory and its application in practice became evident, the stronger became their obstinacy. The more I debated with them, the more familiar I became with their argumentative tactics. At the outset they counted upon the stupidity of their opponents, but when they got so entangled that they could not find a way out, they played the trick of acting as innocent simpletons. Should they fail, in spite of their tricks of logic, they acted as if they could not understand the counter-arguments and bolted away to another field of discussion. They would lay down truisms and platitudes, and, if you accepted these, then they were applied to other problems and matters of an essentially different nature from the original theme. If you faced them with this point they would escape again, and you could not bring them to make any precise statement. Whenever one tried to get a firm grip on any of these apostles, one's hand grasped only jelly and slime, which slipped through the fingers and combined again into a solid mass a moment afterwards. If your adversary felt forced to give in to your argument, on account of the observers present, and if you then thought that at last you had gained ground, a surprise was in store for you on the following day. The Jew would be utterly oblivious to what had happened the day before, and he would start once again by repeating his former absurdities, as if nothing had happened. Should you become indignant and remind him of yesterday's defeat, he pretended astonishment and could not remember anything, except that on the previous day he had proved that his statements were correct. Sometimes I was dumbfounded. I do not know what amazed me the more, the abundance of their verbiage or the artful way in which they dressed up their falsehoods. I gradually came to hate them.
Amazing how Hitler described arguing a Marxist 100 years ago, and just in case anyone is wondering, no, I am not a Nazi. I only remember Chapter 2 of Mein Kampf because Chapter 2 sent shivers up my spine when he talked about the Marxists, and about how the newspapers that leaned towards Marxism seemed to carry an anti-nationalist theme. They acted very critical of Germany, while seeming to praise other nations, such as the great culture of France. I remember the way it made me feel to read that because it clicked with so many things happening right now. Hitler tried to tie all this to the Jews. Well, I lack the historical knowledge to weigh in on that. But I'll say this, I have known Jews who were deeply opposed to Marxism and its derivatives, and most of the Marxists I have spoken to aren't Jews. And as I said, when Hitler spoke about the way the Marxist Jews would argue and then forget the argument the next day, that's just the way Marxists themselves are. Perhaps he had more luck with his own countrymen because of their patriotism, whereas the Jews, and I am only speculating here, felt like the minority they were, felt like outsiders, had a sense of alienation, and therefore were more mentally fit to be indoctrinated by Marxism, which does by the very nature of its philosophy cater to the mindset of the minorities and the disenfranchised, and is also why it has the utmost contempt for patriotism, and the mainstream religion. After all, cultural Marxism seeks to divide people and then divide those people, and continuously create division, until there is no loyalty to nation, not by mechanism of patriotism, or culturally reinforcing religion. It creates divisions, calls the majority oppressors, the minorities oppressed, and encourages hostility towards the mainstream, amplifying alienation. The reason for this can be understood in this video. Link 1, Orwell created the Goldstein character that would be the target of the 2 minutes hate, as a way of expressing his contempt for those who sought to place the blame for communism squarely on the Jews. I guess Hitler would be a great example of just that. A quick quote from Orwell's Wikipedia says,
writing in the spring of 1945 a long essay titled Anti-Semitism in Britain, for the Contemporary Jewish Record, Orwell stated that anti-Semitism was on the increase in Britain, and that it was irrational and would not yield to arguments. He argued that it would be useful to discover why anti-Semites could swallow such absurdities on one particular subject while remaining sane on others. He wrote, for quite 6 years the English admirers of Hitler contrived not to learn of the existence of Dachau and Buchenwald. Many English people have heard almost nothing about the extermination of German and Polish Jews during the present war. Their own anti-Semitism has caused this vast crime to bounce off their consciousness. In 1984, written shortly after the war, Orwell portrayed the party as enlisting anti-Semitic passions against their enemy, Goldstein.
But I want to get back to the issue of the language, and since I've already made one Mein Kampf reference, another can't hurt. Also from Chapter 2 he says,
the more I became acquainted with the external forms of social democracy, the greater became my desire to understand the inner nature of its doctrines. For this purpose the official literature of the party could not help very much. In discussing economic questions its statements were false and its proofs unsound. In treating of political aims its attitude was insincere. Furthermore, its modern methods of chicanery in the presentation of its arguments were profoundly repugnant to me. Its flamboyant sentences, its obscure and incomprehensible phrases, pretended to contain great thoughts, but they were devoid of thought, and meaningless. One would have to be a decadent bohemian in one of our modern cities in order to feel at home in that labyrinth of mental aberration, so that he might discover intimate experiences amid the stinking fumes of this literary dadaism. These writers were obviously counting on the proverbial humility of a certain section of our people, who believe that a person who is incomprehensible must be profoundly wise. In confronting the theoretical falsity and absurdity of the doctrine with the reality of its external manifestations, I gradually came to have a clear idea of the ends at which it aimed.
The part about the flamboyant language really got me. I tried learning about communism, and just sat there saying what the fuck, who talks like this, what language is this? An example of that goddamn Marxist commie talk in the social justice circle of feminism can be seen in my SFU Men's Center video. Practically after every cut I had to stop and ask what the fuck are these people talking about? The use of big flamboyant words, and many of their commonplace words having double meaning, they string all this shit together and the common observer will be a little befuddled over the long-winded string of complex words, yet totally misled by the hijacked words with the double meanings. This has an interesting effect on people. It makes them assume one thing, while being horribly vague about the details, and all the while acts as something of a secret code to the in-crowd who also speak this language. And I'm not trying to say that they actually practice and rehearse a secret language, it's just something that happens. The in-crowd get it, the outsiders are confused. It's like these people use a couple of catchy words such as freedom, equality, justice, and claim that's all they are about, and how their opponents are completely against it. They draw you in with lots of hooting and hollering and arm waving. They prey on your sense of resent, your sense of alienation, your neediness to belong and be accepted. When they have used their words to grab you off the street and into their club, you may inquire exactly how their opponents limit freedom, equality, justice, and they will point out all the unfairness, all of the imperfections of the system. Then you will ask how they have a solution, and they will hit you over the head with such long-winded words, an endless tirade of the most obscure and flamboyant words like a religious person in a church falling to the ground and speaking in tongues, and you won't know what any of it means, and slowly but surely you will get inducted further and further into their circle, until you are now one of them. I sometimes think these people are aware of what they fight, but they are clueless as to what they actually stand for, and when asked what it is they stand for, other than naming the things they are against, all they have is hollow rhetoric they spout like a fanatic speaking in tongues and getting high on the sound of their own rhetoric. I swear, Marxism is like a cult, and all of its trappings, all of its smoke and mirrors, is capitalizing on the resent of the disenfranchised, or marginalized, as they put it, and it's the language. It's all about the language. From the Wikipedia page on Marxism, under criticisms it says this.
Some Marxists have criticized the academic institutionalization of Marxism for being too shallow and detached from political action. For instance, Zimbabwean Trotskyist Alex Kalinikos, himself a professional academic, stated that its practitioners remind one of Narcissus, who in the Greek legend fell in love with his own reflection. Sometimes it is necessary to devote time to clarifying and developing the concepts that we use, but indeed for Western Marxists this has become an end in itself. The result is a body of writings incomprehensible to all but a tiny minority of highly qualified scholars.
And that's coming from a Trotskyist, who is not an outsider or opponent of Marxism. It has been said by, I believe it was Karl Marx himself, that there are two kinds of people who most misunderstand Marxism, and that is the anti-Marxist and the pro-Marxists, or maybe it was Engels or Lenin. Again, the entire smoke and mirrors of this ideology, is its language and the vagueness of the specifications. Orwell had this to say about language.
In his essay Politics in the English Language, 1946, Orwell wrote about the importance of precise and clear language, arguing that vague writing can be used as a powerful tool of political manipulation because it shapes the way we think. In that essay, Orwell provides 6 rules for writers. Never use a metaphor, simile or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Never use the passive where you can use the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. Break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. Andrew N. Rubin argues, Orwell claimed that we should be attentive to how the use of language has limited our capacity for critical thought, just as we should be equally concerned with the ways in which dominant modes of thinking have reshaped the very language that we use. The adjective Orwellian connotes an attitude and a policy of control by propaganda, surveillance, misinformation, denial of truth, and manipulation of the past. In 1984, Orwell described a totalitarian government that controlled thought by controlling language, making certain ideas literally unthinkable. Several words and phrases from 1984 have entered popular language. Newspeak is a simplified and obfuscatory language designed to make independent thought impossible. Doublethink means holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. The thought police are those who suppress all dissenting opinion. Profeed is homogenized, manufactured superficial literature, film and music, used to control and indoctrinate the populace through docility. Big Brother is a supreme dictator who watches everyone.
I think I should mention that there are many words that don't necessarily take away your ability to have certain thoughts, but they certainly take away your ability to speak certain thoughts. Words of bigotry like sexist, homophobe, Islamophobe, racist, xenophobe. These words connote an unreasonable hatred of a demographic of people, and the cultural Marxist, or more accurately in this particular example, Your average leftist will turn every issue into a social issue. Once it becomes a social issue, you have to stand on the politically correct side of the fence, or they will brand you with one of those deadly forms of bigotry which can cost you your job and more. An example of how a non-racial issue becomes a racial issue is immigration. The government's refusal to take any real action and enforce its own laws, allowing Mexicans to flood the country unlawfully and put hard-working low-class Americans out of a job by working cheap under the table and skipping the taxes and all that. If you, or a politician, object to this obvious injustice, accusations of racism will come hurling towards you from the leftists. Another example is Bill Maher, and other liberal assholes, who constantly insist that if a non-Democrat has any problem with Obama, they're racists. I've heard Bill Maher many of times make such statements that it's not Obama's policies Republicans don't like, it's his skin color. Speaking of radical leftist Bill Maher, he had this to say about the new racism.
The new racism is denying racism.
Interesting, really interesting. Isn't it funny how not long ago there was some moderately popular incident where this white guy on a bus who was beat up by a bunch of blacks shouting racial epithets at him, and remember the verdict was that these blacks were not guilty of a hate crime in spite of the racial epithets, because race was not necessarily the motive. In fact, there is no shortage of news reports where blacks beat up whites, yell racial epithets, and it's never a hate crime. Golly, Bill Maher, I thought denying racism was the new racism. Oh, that's right. Like everything else in our Marxist social justice warrior culture, it's a one-way street. Only whites can be racist, only men can be sexist, only straight people can be phobic, only Christianity can be a bad religion, and so on. Just look at what Aria Richards says. And that reminds me of this woman, and this guy.
Because as soon as you come at something from a place of privilege, you're exercising your privilege, and therefore minimizing the plight of the marginalized person to whom you're speaking.
Straight people are fucking awful. I hate straight men. Straight people ruin everything. Did that offend you when I just said that thing that I just said? When we were kids, I think we were all very specifically told, you can't say things like, I hate black people, because it's wrong to judge someone by the colour of their skin. It's wrong to say, I hate someone of a specific race. Really what they meant to teach us was perpetuating racism towards all these marginalised races in a world made for white people is wrong. The impression that so many of us, if not most of us, got is saying you hate white people is just as bad as saying you hate black people. And I think that is translated into our idea of queerness as well. Saying I hate straight people is not like saying I hate gay people. If you think it is, then you don't understand your privilege.
In cultural Marxist philosophy, there is an oppressed, and an oppressor, and all attacks onto the oppressor class are justified.
When you're the one in power, as males are, and when you make up the majority that writes all laws, as males do, and when you make up the majority that controls all media, as males do, you cannot be culturally, institutionally, or relationally discriminated against or oppressed. Individual cases of women disliking men merely means that there are women who have a reasonable dislike for something.
Once the disenfranchised, whose mind has been corrupted by Marxism, labels you an oppressor class, you cease to have rights. All bigotry and injustices to you shall be ignored by the cultural Marxists, and in any case where it cannot be ignored, it is justified as deserved hatred, deserved discrimination. The endgame for cultural Marxism is to divide society into many different classes, each one proclaiming victimhood, each one demanding the government step in and make things equal, thus a big government ruling over the people with an iron fist, and giving everyone their equal rations, handouts, and corporations now being controlled by the government being told who to hire and who to fire and how much anyone can be paid for any given thing. Thus the corporations shall be effectively owned and controlled by the government. Cultural Marxism is a means to total Marxism. Again, it's pushing for a communist nation by destabilizing the nation by creating division among the people. But back to how the Marxists, leftists, turn political issues into social justice issues, then insists that any social injustice an oppressor class experiences is either non-existent, deserved, or is actually a government-based class issue, not a social issue. And Michael Moore in his Bowling for Columbine documentary attempted to connect the NRA to the KKK, and tie gun rights to white supremacism.
Now it's time for a brief history of the United States of America. Hi, boys and girls, ready to get started? Once upon a time, there were these people in Europe called pilgrims, and they were afraid of being persecuted. So they all got in a boat and sailed to the new world where they wouldn't have to be scared ever again.
Oh, I'm so relaxed.
I feel so much safer. But as soon as they arrived, they were greeted by savages, and they got scared all over again. Indians! So they killed them all. Now, you'd think wiping out a race of people would calm them down, but no. Instead, they started getting frightened of each other. Witch! So they burned witches. In 1775, they started killing the British so they could be free. And it worked, but they still didn't feel safe. So they passed a Second Amendment which said every white man could keep his gun. I loves my gun. Loves my gun. Which brings us to the genius idea of slavery. You see, boys and girls, the white people back then were also afraid of doing any work. So they went to Africa, kidnapped thousands of black people, brought them back to America, and forced them to work very hard for no money. And I don't mean no money like I work at Walmart and make no money. I mean $0. Nothing. Not a zip. Doing it that way made the USA the richest country in the world. So did having all that money and free help calm the white people down? No way. They got even more afraid. That's because after 200 years of slavery, the black people now outnumbered the white people in many parts of the South. Well, you can pretty much guess what came next. The slaves started rebelling. There were uprisings. An old master's head got chopped off. And when white people heard of this, they were freaking out and going, I want to live. Don't kill me, big black man. Well, just in the nick of time came Samuel Colt, who in 1836 invented the first weapon ever that could be fired over and over without having to reload. And all the Southern whites were like, yeah! But it was too late. The North soon won the Civil War and the slaves were freed. Yep, they were free now to go chop all the old masters' heads off. And everybody was like, oh no, we're gonna die. But the freed slaves took no revenge. They just wanted to live in peace. But you couldn't convince the white people of this. So they formed the Ku Klux Klan. And in 1871, the same year the Klan became an illegal terrorist organization, another group was founded, the National Rifle Association. Soon politicians passed one of the first gun laws, making it illegal for any black person to own one. It was a great year for America, the KKK and the NRA. Of course, they had nothing to do with each other, and this was just a coincidence. One group legally promoted responsible gun ownership, and the other group shot and lynched black people. And that's the way it was all the way to 1955, when a black woman broke the law by refusing to move to the back of the bus. White people just couldn't believe it. Huh? Why won't she move? What's going on? Man, all hell broke loose. Black people everywhere started demanding their rights, and white people had a major freaky field meltdown, and they were all like, run away! Run away! And they did. They all ran fleeing to the suburbs where it was all white and safe and clean. And they went out and bought 250 million guns and put locks on the doors, alarms in the houses, and gates around the neighborhoods. And finally, they were all safe and secure and snug as a bug. And everyone lived happily ever after.
Abortion, which at face value is not a sex issue, has become a sex issue. Abortion is now a part of women's rights, and if you are against abortion, you are called anti-woman.
Pro-life. Pro-life. These people aren't pro-life, they're killing doctors. What kind of pro-life is that? What, they'll do anything they can to save a fetus, but if it grows up to be a doctor, they just might have to kill it? They're not pro-life. You know what they are? They're anti-woman. Simple as it gets. Anti-woman.
We've heard leftists such as George Carlin and Bill Maher, or just your average feminist, claim that abortion is a women's issue, and those opposed to abortion are just males being anti-woman. And yet, according to this article, link to, 60% of women want abortion made illegal and 61% of men want abortion made illegal. The sex discrepancy is 1%. How is this a case of men trying to take away women's rights? They constantly try to turn political issues into social justice issues, so that if you stand on the wrong side of the fence they can hammer you with accusations that you're some kind of an ist, some kind of a phobe. And then notice when some white guy gets the balls to stand up to this shit and point out one or more injustices to whites, the social justice warrior, or liberal, or leftist of sorts, will then backpedal and tell you not to be challenging this on a social level. It's not a racial struggle, it's a class struggle. It's all about fighting off our tyrannical government. Notice when some man gets the balls to fight back against feminist bullshit and starts pointing out some very real injustices to men, the feminist social justice warrior immediately tries to tell you it's not a gender struggle, it's not a social struggle, you're wasting your time fighting feminism, there are bigger fish to fry, it's a class struggle, it's the government, it's the system.
But it doesn't do us any good to try and play the who's the bigger victim card, and it doesn't really make any real attempt to rectify these problems in reality. I think that we live in a society that is mired in countless problems, from sexism to racism to wealth inequality and militarism and imperialism. I think society has countless problems, and we should actually work to try and resolve them, rather than just have these hysterical discussions where we try and discredit one faction's problems with another faction's problems. That's working towards somebody else's divide and conquer strategy. All right, the people who really have power, the people who are really sending men off to die in wars because of the draft, the men who own the coal mines that the men have to work in, that divide and conquer works for them. It works for the power elite. They want white males fighting feminists, and, white people in a backlash against minority concerns. They want to divide and conquer to maintain their own power. All right? Feminism is not your enemy. They have a set of issues. Maybe you disagree with those issues. Maybe you say they're not real problems or they're intractable parts of the human condition. That's fair. But it is a distraction from any sort of proactive approach to the real problems of the world. And I think people should bear that in mind before they start getting hysterical over what feminazis are doing on the internet.
Another question: why shouldn't I oppose feminism? It's a waste of time, for one thing. It's sort of like trying to get rid of hornets by killing the hornets instead of destroying the nest. You should oppose human rights being valued based on their profit to those in power, money, power votes, social status, rather than feminism. Feminists have very little real power anywhere.
Isn't that amazing how that works out? They, meaning any branch, any division of the Marxist-tainted left, take things like guns, abortion, illegal immigration, things that have nothing to do with sex and race, and turn it into a social cause involving sex and race. And yet when you, being either cis, heterosexual, white, or male, argue them on a genuine social issue, they do the polar opposite and try to tell you it's not a social issue. Anytime a person who has been labeled as a member of the so-called oppressor class fights back against this social justice Marxist shit, they are told not to fight back against the people that attack them, fight back against the system, because there are bigger fish to fry. Am I the only one here seeing dishonesty as the number one trait of Marxism, the confusing, convoluted, flamboyant language, the use of vague words, and vague concepts, all the double-speak and double-think, the constant changing definitions of every word, the deceitful tactics in arguing? Come on, if there was one word, just one word to describe all of this, it would be dishonest. Speaking of dishonest, something RockingMrE and Bernard Chapin said about cultural Marxists.
And I need to do a real brief introduction again on what cultural Marxism is. We always get guys on here. Kids are programmed today to, when they hear the word Marxism, think, that's an idiot. That's some kind of rube. That's a hater who's saying that. I get these leftist MRAs with their little kitty cattery coming here and they go, you're Joe McCarthy. You have a list of leftists in your pocket. And they say things like that. You cannot get the other side to accurately tell you what they believe in. They attack you. They won't even tell you what their beliefs are. It's almost impossible to debate somebody when you're the only one who's taking a position.
Political correctness, the religion of the left. But although there are differences between these two conflicting forms of feminism, both use critical theory to attack the idea of patriarchy. From the 70s onwards, a new left of progressives had taken on the theories of cultural Marxism and adopted the new term political correctness to safeguard against any opposition. So when we look back over the history of political correctness, we can see that it's deeply entrenched in the ideology of cultural Marxism. And it's easy to point out when we realise that political correctness depends on critical theory for its success. Political correctness has become a weapon for the political left and thus the state itself to persecute the individual that doesn't adhere to the Orwellian newspeak doctrine it enforces. But the most worrying thing about political correctness results from the critical theory that drives it, which actively seeks to demonise those that cultural Marxists perceived to be the rulers of society. Sadly, this means that if you're white and male, then boy, you're in for a hard time. The really intellectually dishonest thing about critical theory comes into play when we consider that the Frankfurt School originally perceived the bourgeois and organised religion as the taint upon society, which is largely true, but gradually it became the agenda of cultural Marxists to attack more than this, and in Western society it was white men that mainly fell under this umbrella. Which in itself shows that Stalin was diabolically calculating in his effort to use not only the Nazis but the Allies to succeed in his plans. With Stalin destroying the credibility of communism through his tyrannical rule of the USSR, international socialists began to search for other ways to further their goals. While some still believed in classically Marxist violent revolution, others felt a gradualist approach would be more successful. It was during this time that cultural Marxism began to grow in popularity due to its focus on the undermining of Western values, and foremost among the pseudo-intellectuals leading this change was one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse's ideas would become central to the civil rights movement in the 60s, and it was his books, Eros and Civilization and One-Dimensional Man, that he became most well known for. Herbert Marcuse is believed by many to be the father of the new left that emerged after the civil rights movement, and he was particularly sympathetic towards feminism. He strongly believed that women were the key to a cultural revolution, and he also believed that feminism was essential if this was to be a success. In an interview, which I'll link to below, you can hear Marcuse talk about his theories and ideas in his own words, and confirm the points I present here, which again thoroughly dispels the myth that cultural Marxism is a conspiracy. Marcuse's ideas again became influential within the politically correct orthodoxy that emerged during the 80s, and it was Marcuse's essay, Repressive Tolerance, that set out the intolerance towards those that were perceived as, among other things, chauvinistic, but even includes those that oppose the expansion of public services. As you can see, this is a typically intolerant socialist attitude, which has led to the dismantling of individual liberty in favour of collective tyranny and politically correct silencing tactics, which prevents any rational discussion from taking place. Of course, you're always going to get leftists muddying arguments that expose or refute them, and even if I made 1,000 videos, this would always be the case, since they'll do anything to come out on top. But I don't make videos to try to convert those beyond reason. Instead, I concentrate on raising the awareness of those that are open-minded and actively want solutions to collectivism. A quick scan through the Wikipedia entry for cultural Marxism will immediately show that this is a term contested by those on the left, and much to the annoyance of leftists, one that others like to label leftists with. Some consider cultural Marxism to be a pejorative, or in other words, an insulting term. There is some truth in this because leftists notoriously rename themselves when the public becomes increasingly aware of what it is they represent. This can be demonstrated in the fact that often leftists don't even like to use the word socialism to describe themselves anymore in the mainstream arena. Today, leftists often prefer to use the term progressive, but this is merely an attempt to frame anything that originates from the left as positive, while all those that don't identify with their values as regressive, and thus intolerant or oppressive.
I miss good old RockingMrE. It's a shame this whole marriage issue caused him to fucking flip and turn on MGTOW and renounce the MRA label as well. I cannot find the original video I was searching for by RockingMrE, where he said it was common for a cultural Marxist to come right out and tell you that there is no such thing, it's just a conspiracy theory. I wanted to use that clip, because it's so true. I have seen no shortage of comments on my previous videos telling me that cultural Marxism is a conspiracy theory, and or it has no more validity than patriarchy. I have had no shortage of insulting comments about what a fool I am, what a right-wing conspiracy theorist I am to believe in cultural Marxism, followed by other insults and incoherent political mumblings, and I have no idea if those people are for real, or if they're just trolls. They, most of them, are unbelievably stupid and belligerent. It feels like trolling behavior, but I suspect they are genuine. I guess I have to point out, when I refer to these leftists, calling them cultural Marxists, I am generalizing. I am aware that not all leftists are like that. I am also not claiming that everyone who has ever voted for the Democratic Party is a Marxist. But, if you are in that social justice warrior club, and you champion political correctness, then yeah, you're a fucking commie Marxist piece of shit. I've had people leave me comments telling me that the leftists can be an asset to us because they want equality, they believe in the social justices, and see the treatment of men as unjust, and one of the people that told me this, or something to that effect, confessed being a leftist, and he happens to be a long-time subscriber, and was very polite. The problem I have with the statement is as demonstrated with Bill Maher, cultural Marxism is a one-way street. Men can only be oppressors, whites can only be oppressors, heterosexuals can only be oppressors, and so on, until heterosexuals are a minority, and a minority within government. Heterosexuals will always be the evil oppressive class, so long as the Western world is made up mostly of white people, or of the white race being the most numerically significant of the collective races, and this also is true of the governments of the Western world. White people will always be considered the oppressors, and while men are by a fraction a minority, they still make up the majority of corporations and government, thus their power is direct power, thus they are the oppressor class. Those leftists among us, those social justice warriors who are also saying what about the men? They're blue pills in the social justice circles. They're not the red pill cultural Marxists that pull the strings and direct the intellectual traffic of the social justices. To put it simply, they don't get it, and what we end up with is woolly bumblebee types. Now let's recap this video. SubMan USN makes a video noticing certain concepts found in the George Orwell novel 1984, appearing in modern-day life, and properly identifies it coming from the social justice warriors and feminists. I point out that Orwell's novel was based on totalitarianism under Stalinism, and it was made as a jab against communism. I then mention the reason we see it in modern day, and the reason it comes from the social justice warriors is due to cultural Marxism. 1984 was a bit of a warning to the dystopia that could come from the implementation of Marxism. Today, we are living in that Marxist dystopia. I also pointed to the language. It is very important that we remember how language is used by the Marxists. And my last note was about the dishonesty. Folks, as an atheist, I have had many debates with Christian fundamentalists, the creationists, and here's the thing, at times I sensed dishonesty in some of these debates, but nothing like having a debate with someone whose mind has been corrupted by Marxism. I had one guy in one of my last videos ask what I had against Marxism, due to my use of the phrase cultural Marxism, and my answer in the comments was simple: I hate the people. I won't even debate on why Marxism sucks as an economic model. And to be honest, I can't find it in me to defend capitalism. All I can say is, capitalism sucks, but Marxism is not a solution. And truth be told, I am not an economist. I can't go over the points of Marxism versus communism with a fine-tooth comb, because I don't know enough about economics to do that. My argument against Marxism mainly comes to, have you spoken to these people? Marxist individuals tend to be the biggest assholes, the most horrific liars, the biggest walking piles of shit on the earth. I'd say put a bullet in a commie's head, but come on, the price of bullets is getting ridiculous these days. They are the most dishonest people to ever walk the face of the earth. And what can be done about them? Nothing. I don't think there is much you can do for them. I don't know how much of their deception is personal and how much of it is outward. Who do they lie to more, us or themselves? Also, I have two competing theories on them. The first theory is that the Marxist teachings corrupts the intellectual mind, the cognitive mind, then corrupts the subconscious mind, and a long enough time of thinking in the same terms as the dialectic one's rhetoric is based on, eventually rewires the brain to perceive information in a corrupt way. Now it is widely known that the brain lays down new pathways and does this in a way that corresponds to its environment. I would give billions of links, but you guys know how I feel about neuroscience being garbage. I hate neuroscience even when it supports my case. I feel like I am reading pure sensationalist bullshit for the sake of headlines and alarmism. At any rate, the brain can be rewired in some way to some degree, as a result of constant modes of thought and environmental stimulation. The degree of rewiring and what it all means is anyone's guess. I mean, it is neuroscience we're talking about. So, I imagine viewing the world through Marxist eyes long enough can rewire the brain to perceive information in a new way, and make someone instinctively deceitful. Maybe sometimes they're not even aware of their own deceit, like maybe it makes them pathological liars. The other theory I have is that no real rewiring of the brain takes place, no more so than any other mode of thought or ideological adherence. But what is actually happening is that all the bitter, hateful, resentful, lazy, dishonest people in the world are attracted to Marxism like flies to shit. I mean, think about it. Marxism is an ideology that, when all is said and done, states that the strong must be obligated to give the weak a helping hand, or just a handout. It implies that the straight A student should be given a higher grade to make him feel better, and that the straight A student should be given a lower grade so that everyone comes out fair and equal. Well, what sort of mind does that idea cater to? The smart, hard-working straight A student sure as fuck doesn't want to do the same work only to achieve a lower grade, but the lazy class clown might want to get a better grade for the hell of it. The person who has spent 20 years working 40 or more hours a week doesn't want his taxes doubled to support the unemployed, but the lazy welfare queen sure would be in favor of a welfare state, and so on and so forth. Society's bottom feeders, society's losers, they're the ones that want a system of forced equal outcome. They are stupid, and or weak, and or ugly, and or lazy, and just all around pathetic. This makes them resentful, and human ego makes them look at themselves as infallible. It's the rest of the world that has the problem, not them. We see this with all the fat feminists who whine and complain that their grotesque obesity is beautiful and sexy, and all those thin anorexic models on the cover of Sports Illustrated is a patriarchal conspiracy to rewire men's libidos into rejecting fat old women because patriarchy, damn it. Many people become this way. They live as losers, and they stop taking blame. They believe it's the rest of the world holding them down. They're victims, it's not their fault. They've been cheated, and everyone around them is privileged, and they shouldn't be privileged. And any system that forces the privileged to let go of their privilege and share their wealth and success with the cheated oppressed class is a great ideology. I think these people, we'll call them losers, gravitate to Marxism like flies to shit. Either way, you've got a bunch of losers propagating Marxism, or who knows, maybe it's a little of both. Maybe it starts out with weak, lazy, resentful losers finding an ideology that artificially boosts them by punishing the smart, the strong, the winners, and then the rhetoric, the dialectic, it sinks into their head, poisons their mind, and turns them into a bunch of assholes. Now I know in this video I am knocking the left, and I am doing it pretty hard, and I make no apologies for that. I've already said I am talking about the leftists in general, and I am not making the claim that there are no exceptions, but I want to be upfront. I'm not right-wing, and your average right-wing asshole gets on my nerves too. These are people who want government out of people's lives, but only because government is secular. You replace government with the church, and they're all in favor of big government now. They want less federal government in school, and more Jesus in the classroom. They want a free market, which translates to giving full control of the nation to global industry. I really don't know what the difference is between the iron fist of a government and the iron fist of a corporation. Sure, social justice warriors on the left erect speech laws and habitually report dissenting opinions as harassment or some sort of inflammatory speech, but advertisers also pressure corporations, such as newspapers, magazines, YouTube, television networks, radio stations, into what ideas are permissible. Corporate interest is what pushes alcohol and tobacco, while restricting marijuana and cocaine. Corporations do erect laws that restrict our freedom, and if you hate the socialist taxes, I find it hard to believe you prefer slave labor camps, and inflated costs due to monopolies, and if you're against those evil commies because they typically support globalism, that whole one world government thing, let me ask you this, what's stopping the global banking industry? What's stopping a global media conglomeration that will be in charge of the world's propaganda, I mean, news and entertainment, if the oil industry, pharmaceutical industry, banking industry, real estate industry, and media, all team up as one collective and cohesive force, which without government interference could very well happen, then what stops them from having as much control over the world as the UN does right now, especially when you consider they have all the money, and due to media they also have control over the flow of information? I'm sorry, but try as I might, I can't figure out the difference between being owned and controlled by an overpowered government, overpowered church establishment, or overpowered corporation. Of course, having all three at each other's throats means I have a sliver of a chance of experiencing freedom, so long as these three forces are battling it out for supremacy. They keep each other in line and we the people can pick up the crumbs that fall from the table. Is the left a problem? Yes, but the right isn't an answer. It's just a proposition for another set of equally bad ideas, and ultimately neither side gives a shit about men's rights, which is my concern, which is why I don't give a shit about the left or the right, and find people who loudly advocate for either to be useless and obnoxious. I also find those who put their left-wing or right-wing cultism ahead of the men's rights movement, actually do more harm than good to the MRM. Now with that said, if you're left-wing, because you support abortion rights or want to limit corporate power or whatever, and this is the extent of your motives for voting for a Democrat, then there is a good chance I am not referring to you when I refer to leftists. If you support social policies that take from the deserving and give to the undeserving to make equal, to force an equal outcome, then you are a communist Marxist asshole. But here's the thing, for those leftists, even the ones with the Marxist taint, who are sympathetic to the MRM, assuming you're not here to hijack it with tales of how us men need to be liberated from our masculinity, and how we should get in bed with the LGBT etc. But assuming you really are sympathetic to the MRM for whatever reason, I want to try to use that as a starting point. Look at the rest of the social justices. You've seen the bullshit from the feminists. Are you somehow just not aware of the rest of the social justices being identical? And if you can begin to see all the parallels between feminism and every other social justice circle, then you must come to realize how all of the social justices are corrupt. Their stated goals are not their true goals, and you will begin to see the cultural Marxism within it. You will see the mechanism, everyone running on hatred and bigotry, everyone playing victim Olympics, everyone believing the man or the system owes them a handout. You will come to see the dishonesty, the victimhood mentality, and you will see the I'm owed something mentality. You will see how it is all connected to socialism, and more accurately Marxism. I just ask that if you've come this far, that you're over here supporting the MRM, that you finish opening your eyes and seeing the big problem, the big picture, not just this one facet. I'm not asking that you become right-wing, or take up their groupthink, only that you drop the leftist groupthink. And if men's rights is the only facet you end up caring about, that's fine. That's pretty much the boat I'm in at this point. But just be aware of the cultural Marxism, the evils of the social justice warriors. And now that I've pissed off the left, time to piss off the right with my next video.